For South Carolina Public Radio, this is the South Carolina Lede. I'm your host, Gavin Jackson, and this episode was recorded on July 8th, 2024. Yes, my 38th birthday from Charleston, South Carolina.
Happy birthday!
And a programming note besides me having my birthday today and working on vacation for you, my dear listeners. This is another special episode of The Lede for you today as part of our summer series.
Wow!
We will be back on schedule on Saturday, and then we will be bringing you complete coverage starting next week from the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, folks.
Actually, it's pronounced Milwaukee.
We will have exclusive podcast coverage, social media videos on our platforms, rolling web updates on southcarolinapublicradio.org, and a dedicated episode recapping all of it on This Week in South Carolina. That's right. I don't think anyone else from South Carolina is doing that, folks. But we are. For you.
We're not worthy! We're not worthy! We're not worthy!
And of course, The Lede loves hearing from everyone. That's why we have a voicemail box set up that you can share your thoughts to, your hot takes, your questions at 803-563-7169. Leave us your name, where you're calling from, and what's on your mind. It's summertime. We just celebrated America's birthday. Let us know how you're feeling. 803-563-7169. On today's Lede, we're looking at a new limited podcast series called 40 Acres and a Lie, which is a riff off of the promise of 40 acres and a mule for formerly enslaved people following the Civil War. It is a 3-part series from Reveal and the Center for Public Integrity, which tells the history of an often misunderstood government program that gave more than 1,200 formerly enslaved people land titles, only to take that land back, fueling a wealth gap that remains today. Before we get into my interview with one of the reporters who worked on the podcast, as well as a descendant whose great-great-grandfather worked on Edisto Island and fought to get the land after freedom, I want to share with you the podcast trailer.
40 acres and a mule. I've heard that phrase all my life, and I really thought I knew the history behind it, but I didn't. I knew that after surviving the brutality of slavery, newly freed Black people were made a promise of land.
Black people had a vision that if I can get my toehold in this land, I can take care of myself.
But what I didn't know is that it was more than that.
It was a program. It was rolled out. There are documents to show it.
Land titles, ink on paper. After the Civil War, the federal government actually gave formerly enslaved people land, 40 acres, and then took it back.
Can you imagine? I can't.
They had it, and then they just pulled the rug from under them, so to speak.
This was a betrayal.
More than 150 years later, reporters from the Center for Public Integrity uncovered many of those land titles, the people who got them and where.
Samuel Miller, 40 acres on Edisto.
Fergus Wilson, 40 acres on Sapelo Island.
Primus Morrison, 40 acres on Edisto.
Lucy Crosby.
Philip Young.
Amos Jackson.
Cyrus Jenkins.
So far, we found more than 1,200 people who got land and had it taken away. We found some of their descendants.
Great-grandfather. That's my great-grandfather. I had to tell somebody.
And we met people who own that land today.
My question is, where do we go from here? Do they want it back?
Having hard conversations about what's owed.
I don't know. I wish I had an answer to that. I'm not happy with where this world is or where this country is right now.
That's why we're trying to understand what do we think we should do to try to reckon with that past.
Turn that thing off for a second.
From Reveal and the Center for Public Integrity, 40 Acres and a Lie, a reparation that wasn't and a wealth gap that remains. Our 3-part series starts June 15th on Reveal. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.
Now here's part of my conversation with reporter April Simpson. She's with the Center for Public Integrity, and Teresa Jenkins Hilliard, whose great-great-grandfather, Jim Hutchinson, was born enslaved on Peters Point Plantation in Edisto Island around 1836. He was the son of an enslaved woman named Maria and her enslaver, Isaac Jenkins Mickle. Now, I start with asking April about the concept of 40 acres and a mule and how it came about after the war.
General Sherman, he is marching towards Savannah. The Union is about to take over the city. And along the way, there are a number of formerly enslaved people who are marching along with him. And when he gets there, there's this question of what are we going to do about all these people? So the Secretary of War encourages General Sherman to meet with a group of ministers and Black faith leaders in Savannah. And the question is put to them, what do you need? What do you want? And one of those ministers tells him, we want land and we want to be left alone. And so General Sherman decides to issue Special Field Orders number 15, which set aside land 30 miles inland from the coast between Charleston and northeastern Florida, St. Johns River, right around Jacksonville, for these formerly enslaved people. And a lot of this land is former plantation land that's now going to be cut up and given to these folks.
And so that being said, you kind of laid out the geography of this land, but where did a lot of these formerly enslaved folks primarily settle? Where was this land pretty much given? I mean, you were talking about plantation land, some of this land that was formerly worked by them. Tell us about it and where they ended up, a lot of them.
You know, a lot of these folks, they ended up on plantations that were often in their communities. So it could have even been the plantation that they worked as a slave. Some of them, because they heard about this wartime order and perhaps were in the military, it's possible some traveled to other places because people in the military were given essentially priority to be able to choose any land at their pleasure. So some could have been from other places as well.
So this was the promise. This was basically the closest thing to reparations enslaved people were going to get.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't the nation's first attempt at reparations, but it was certainly the most famous attempt. But to be clear, the land wasn't really given. They were renting the land for a few years and then would have had the opportunity to buy it after that period.
So then what happened? How did this promise evaporate for these formerly enslaved people?
Yeah, I mean, everything just fell apart because the order was issued while Lincoln was alive. He was assassinated. Andrew Johnson becomes president and does not have the same commitment to this program. And essentially, he begins pardoning a lot of these former plantation owners, former enslavers, giving people their land back. And for a long time, the Freedmen's Bureau resisted. This was the agency that was charged with helping a lot of these formerly enslaved people restart their lives. They distributed land, they provided medical care, education, and other things. So generals who were leading the Freedmen's Bureau, they resisted. I mean, they believed that even though Johnson was issuing these pardons, that it did not include the 40 acres land because that promise had already been made. But, you know, there's a lot of push and pull. The 40 acres program needed Congress to ratify it, and that just never happened. Congress passed a bill, Johnson vetoed it, and then Congress basically passed a weaker version. But ultimately, Johnson just forced their hand, and the land was ultimately returned.
Kind of, I know it's hypothetical here, but we're talking about how, you know, Johnson came into power after Lincoln was assassinated, you know, just days after the Articles of Surrender were agreed to at Appomattox Courthouse. You know, so everything seemed promising. It seemed like everything was going in the right direction, especially for the formerly enslaved folks. Is it conceivable that had Lincoln lived, that the outcome would have been better, that this actually would have gone the distance and would have actually been fully supported?
You know, obviously, I think there still would have been some pushback, but I think that the effort would have been successful because it did have Lincoln's buy-in. You did have legislation from Congress that was passed, but Johnson later vetoed. So while I'm sure there would have been some fierce pushback, I think ultimately the program would have succeeded.
Tell us about the research you and your team did and how you were able to search through these land grants and these records. Tell me about that process before we get into some South Carolina connections here.
So we did a few things. We did genealogical research that helped us track living descendants to some of these formerly enslaved people who received land titles. So how we were able to do this is because a lot of these land records are just starting to become digitized, and the Smithsonian is also transcribing them. So my colleague, Pratik Rabala, he built a tool, an artificial intelligence tool, that was able to comb these 1.8 million documents and pull a lot of the names of these people. We pulled about 1,250 names of people who receive land grants. And this is, hopefully a really important contribution, especially to experts and to people who are invested in doing genealogical research, because earlier, before these things became online, you had to just go to the National Archives and be super specific about what you were looking at or looking for. But now these things are becoming more accessible, and this tool is like essentially a Google search for them.
You've picked a few folks to, I guess, focus on, right? That was probably the easiest way to handle all this.
Yeah, it was definitely a lot. And it is really hard to trace folks from, the person who got the grant in the 1800s to their living descendants today. The easiest way we were able to do this is to kind of pick a few examples. And ultimately, we were able to track down 41 living descendants, several of whom didn't actually know about this history.
Yeah, so let's talk with one of those folks about Jim Hutchinson. We're going to speak with one of his descendants shortly, but I want to hear about his situation, who he was, where he lived, and how he fought for land that was originally given to him.
So Jim Hutchinson was the son of Isaac Jenkins Michael, who was a wealthy plantation owner on Edisto Island, South Carolina. And Hutchinson's mother is believed to be an enslaved woman named Maria, who was the Michael family's house servant. So Jim, he's like a really interesting character. Apparently, he, according to oral history, he never really worked out in the fields. He was fascinated by boats and waterways and spent a lot of his time in enslavement on a lot of those rivers and tributaries in Edisto. And so during the Civil War, he ends up serving in the Navy. He ends up getting this 40 acres land that is ultimately taken back. And he is a real proponent for land ownership for Black people in Edisto. So while that land was taken back, he was able to acquire even more land by organizing Black people after the Civil War, forming cooperatives, and then dividing the land up between them. He acquires about 230 acres. He was also a successful businessman, but unfortunately, he was killed on his family's land when there was a clash with a white store owner who showed up during a 4th of July party. And, the man, Frederick Barth, said his revolver went off accidentally, but he was initially found guilty of manslaughter, and then he appealed and was ultimately acquitted.
So that was quite the exception to a lot of other formerly enslaved folks, right? You were talking about that story with Jim Hutchinson really fighting for that land, what he thought was his and was essentially. So, but for so many other people, that land was gone. Like pretty much that was it. If you didn't fight for it, it was pretty much gone. And I feel like a lot of people that you were talking with too, you mentioned reparation, you mentioned generational wealth, you mentioned how all this stems from these moments back in history. Tell us a little bit about the current landowners and how they have different feelings about this land versus some of the descendants who, could have still had this in the family.
Yeah. So to be clear, I mean, in my reporting, everybody, on both sides of the family gets along, right? And lives, at least for the folks on Edisto, obviously they live in close proximity to each other. But they did disagree on what should have happened to this land back then. So as I said, Jim Hutchinson's father was Isaac Jenkins Michael. And we spent some time with two Michael brothers who are the, I think, great-grandsons of Isaac Jenkins Michael. And they live on a plantation that it was temporarily lost during the Civil War called Peters Point Plantation. It's a beautiful place. And the two brothers have very different ideas on reparations today and to some extent what should have happened to the land back then. So, for example, Pinckney, he is the younger brother. He believes or supports reparations for more modern day discrimination like Jim Crow, but not tying anything back to the injustices of slavery. He feels, there was a war fought over that. And then Jenks, his older brother, does not support reparations. He feels that the government is giving away too much. And, they are both very, very proud and very aware of their history.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, April. I want to ask Teresa now to just introduce yourself, Teresa Hillard. Tell me about your background, Teresa, who you are, your background, where you live, what you do for a living.
Well, my name is Teresa Jenkins Hilliard, and I was born on Edisto Island in the old Freedman's Cottage that my maternal grandmother lived in. I was under her guardianship, I should say, for the first 13 years of my life. She reared me from a hand baby, as they say, until I was 13 years old on Edisto Island. Her only language was Gullah, so she taught me what she knew, which was Gullah. So Gullah was really my first language. My mother was born on Edisto Island as her other children, but she left the island and moved to Charleston for better opportunities. So when she was pregnant with me in her mid-20s, she moved back to Edisto so that she could have the baby at my grandmother's house. So, and after I was born, she left me with my grandmother and went back to Charleston to continue to pursue a better living and better opportunities, because the only opportunities on the island were to work on the farm or either to work under plantation homes as, cooks and babysitters and maids and so forth. So, of course, when you moved to Charleston, you just didn't have to work on the farms, but it was still the cooks and maids and babysitters and so forth. But I grew up the second part of my life in Charleston with my mother. I am a retired federal employee, and I've been retired for quite some time now. So I live in Charleston, near the area that I grew up in after I left my grandmother's home on Edisto Island.
And so, Teresa, tell us a little bit about what do you know about your family's roots when we talk about that land in Edisto? How far have you gone back, and what have you found out recently about it?
Well, we were able to trace it back to my great-great-grandfather, Jim Hutchinson, and all the rich history that April has shared so far. I learned about it, but it didn't really resonate with me at that time. When it really resonated with me was when we were invited to the Point of Pines plantation when the old cabin was being dismantled to be taken to the museum in Washington, D.C. And the Hutchison family, some of us were invited to go and see that cabin dismantled. And when I went to that site for that over that 5 days period, that's when I really, really learned more and became really, really interested, because it was familiar because I had heard it, but I just didn't realize the importance of it. Because when I stepped out of my car on the site, as someone echoed, "Hello, cousin." When I looked over, it was a white lady that was calling me cousin. And I had never had that before. That was my very first experience with that. And I walked over and she says, "You're Teresa, right?" And I say, "Yes, I am Teresa." So she says, "Well, we're cousins." And I thought, wow. So she says, and I see that look on your face. She said, "We shared a great-great-grandfather, Isaac Jenkins Michael." I didn't remember hearing his name before, but I remember the story about Jim Hutchinson being, half white because he was the son of the plantation owner who owned his mother. So I knew that, but I didn't know his name, or at least I didn't remember that his name had been shared with me. So then she sort of took me by the hand and she just started sharing with me the story about our great great grandfather and Jim Hutchinson and so forth. And that's when I really started paying attention. So anyway, Carol was telling me the story, and she shared articles, and that week she had taken us to the plantation that she had inherited, and then she took us to the plantation house, and just shared so much more. I embraced her, she embraced me, and we just chatted for quite some time over the week, and got to know each other. And that's kind of what started the ball rolling with me and researching Jim Hutchinson's story.
And I know I asked April a hypothetical question too, so I'm going to do the same for you too, Teresa, and just ask you, what you would think. How do you think things maybe would have changed, not just for you and your family, but for others, descendants and of formerly enslaved people? How things could have changed if this program would have gone through the way it was supposed to go? If Lincoln wasn't assassinated, if things actually would have worked out. How do you think that would have changed things for folks, not just in Edisto, but maybe in the entire South?
Well, it would have improved their lives tremendously, because that is the only way you could gain generational wealth, was through land. And if you didn't have any land, you had no way of building wealth at all. So if they were given what was promised to them, their lives would have been so much better than it is right now, because we're still feeling the effects of not having land, because the people on the island, and I don't know about other places, but I'm sure there are other places as well, they really are still they're still suffering because they don't have the opportunity that others had. They were not, given the promise. And it was something that not, and the word given is really not a good word, because they would have earned it, because they worked the land from generations to generations for 400 years or so. So they have earned every bit of the land that the government would have given them and more. Because when my ancestors came to this country, this was nothing but forest. They cut down every tree, dug up every stump, plant every crop, harvest every crop, made the plantation, and the plantation built the plantation houses, and every inch of the ground that cotton and rice and whatever was planted on, all of that was done with hoes and makeshift instruments that they use to make those fields. And they were not given anything. And a lot of times they were out there with no shoes, nothing to cover their heads, sometimes hardly enough clothes to shelter them from the sun. And, the conditions were harsh. And a lot of times they didn't have enough sustenance to really give them the strength to do all of this. And many of them lose their lives during this process. And they were property, so they were discarded like property. And we don't even know where our ancestors are buried in most cases. So they are the ones that built America. They built America with their blood, sweat, and tears. And they definitely earned those plantations much more than maybe some others who were given those plantations.
It's really well said, Teresa. And I just want to end with asking you just how you feel in your family. Do you feel like you are owed something? I know we're talking about different landowners in different situations and descendants and ancestors, but should there be compensation for this land that no longer belongs to you? What are your feelings when it comes to discussions about reparations, especially when you can point to documents and you can start tracing this history?
Absolutely, they deserve reparations. I mean, there's just absolutely no question about that. And when we're considering reparations, I don't think it has anything to do with whether lands were abandoned or people were asked to leave or whatever. I don't think any of that should come into consideration. I think the consideration should be simply that the enslaved people built America. They worked for over 400 years from generation to generation. They were never given anything, and they're not asking to be given anything. They just want what they should have gotten all along. They earned it. It's not given to them. They earned it, and they did not get what they earned. So, yes, they should be reparations.
And I know it's not easy to do, but how do you think that should be done? If you could wave a magic wand at this situation, what do you think would be the best way to do it?
Now, I don't know how to answer that because I don't have the capacity to make that determination. So I don't know, what that would look like. But they are people in power who can make that determination. And where there's a will, there's a way. So there's a way to do it. I'm not smart enough to tell you how to do it, but I know that it needs to be done.
You can find all 3 of these podcast episodes of 40 Acres and a Lie by Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting, which is a national nonprofit news organization that produces Mother Jones magazine and website and the Reveal radio show and podcast. Check out revealnews.org to find this podcast, more background, and land titles for formerly enslaved people. It's a really fascinating resource right there, so check that out if you want more information. And that being said, folks, that was the entire podcast. No wind down today, but we will be back. Don't worry. We have a full episode for you on Saturday. And like I told you earlier in the podcast, we'll have complete coverage from the RNC next week. We'll have a lot of wind down, a lot of discussions from that. So stay tuned for the Republican National Convention coverage starting next week from southcarolinapublicradio.org. And of course, us here at the South Carolina Lede. And again, thanks for listening, folks. You can always show us your appreciation by leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or a voicemail at 803-563-7169. And you can stay up to date with the latest news on scetv.org and southcarolinapublicradio.org. And don't forget to support your local newspapers. The South Carolina Lede is a production of South Carolina Public Radio. Our producer is A.T. Shire. Amy Crouch is our supervising producer. Sean Birch is our executive producer. This podcast is produced with support from PRX and is made possible in part by a grant from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, as well as listener contributions to the ETV Endowment of South Carolina. For the South Carolina Lede, I'm Gavin Jackson. Be well, South Carolina.
The French missionaries and explorers were coming here as early as the late 1600s to trade with the Native Americans.
In fact, isn't Milwaukee an Indian name?
Yes, Pete, it is. Actually, it's pronounced Milwaukee, which is Algonquin for the good land.